Thanks, everyone. I think we're ready to get started. My name's Stephanie Dunstan. I'm the Strategic Communications Manager at the Lowy Institute. And just like to thank everyone coming today to our special Food for Thought series. The Food for Thought series is where the Lowy Institute manages to get out of Sydney, out of our home, and actually bring the debate and discussion to Canberra and Melbourne. So hopefully some of you people have been to these events before and hoping we'll be seeing more of you at future events. So we're here today for the topic... The Pacific President comes to Australia, and we've got an hour really here to debate and discuss that, and I'm going to introduce my panellists here. We're very lucky to have Judith Sloan, Professor of Melbourne University and a Lowy Institute board member. Judith is going to be looking at the topic from the interest of the economics regarding this. And then to her right, Andrew Shearer, the Director of Studies at the Lowy Institute. Andrew's going to be bringing some of his unique background and political understanding to really comment on some of the politics of Obama's visit and the context in which he's currently finding himself in the US. And then to his right, we have Dan Flitton from The Age. Dan's really going to be taking a sort of final foreign policy overview of that. So we'll have about 30 minutes to hear from the panellists, and then I'll be encouraging a bit of debate and discussion between them both, because I think they've all got very unique views and individual views. So it'll be good to hear some of that. And then I'll be handing over the microphone to hear from you and have a bit of Q&A, and we'll wrap up so everyone probably can get back to work. Also, sorry, I should have mentioned, special thanks to The Age for hosting us here today in these facilities. So thank you.
I'm used to standing at lecterns, so I think I'll do that. That's okay. Look, I think I should make an admission initially to say that I'm a great fan of America and have traditionally been a very great fan and admirer of the American economy, of its resilience and its dynamism. But I think I also have to make a secondary admission that that enthusiasm for the American economy is being sorely tested at this point in time. I was just saying to my friends here that one of my friends sent me an email with a quote from Justice Scalia, who a lot of you will know of, and it's a good quote because he's saying that societies don't always mature, sometimes they rot. So let me go through just a few points about the US economy, and I'm going to kind of divide it into two spaces. I'm going to say, here are what I see as the negatives, and I'm doing that deliberately so I can end on the positives. But let me just run through some of the negatives about the US economy. First of all, since the GFC, let's date circa 2007, the US experienced the deepest and longest recession that it's experienced since World War II, and you saw that particularly in terms of the figures of industrial production. There has been some recovery. It is a bit anemic, and it really, I think, is looking very uncertain as to whether or not, or let me put it another way, I think you have to put, you could put money on there being a very big recession in the US. My second negative point is about unemployment. It's a really interesting picture, the scene of unemployment in America. It's always been traditionally quite high. It ran maybe at 5% in a sort of full employment scenario. Never any long-term unemployment. So what I mean by that, never any unemployment of a duration of 6 months or 12 months or more. What we've now got, of course, is an unemployment rate that is running in the vicinity of 9 to 10%, and actually we have for the first time long-term unemployment rates which are actually about the same as the Europeans. So what we've seen is a tremendous fall-off in the chance of someone who's unemployed escaping into employment, and that's not the American labour market way. The third negative is that, and given the composition of the audience, you can be upset about this, but this economic slowdown has been much harder on males than on females. You know, the service sector, the healthcare sector, the sectors which are more female intensive have been, to a degree, immune, or not immune, but less affected. And within this, what is actually called a man's session, I quite like the idea of a man's session, is the fact that the middle class are really being hit by what's happening in the American economy and in the labour market. So I think that is another aspect of the negative assessment. Fourthly, and I think it's a part of it's a bad thing, but it's also an explanation of what's happening, is that we've got a continuation in the dire state of housing. What that does is it impedes mobility, so you can't sell your house, you can't get refinanced to buy a house somewhere else. The American labour market was traditionally predicated on very high inflows and outflows. That in turn was predicated on people being prepared to move. But with the housing market being the way they are, people are locked in, possibly in a negative equity situation, unable to move. That, of course, is spilling over into a loss of consumer and reduced confidence. And this is notwithstanding the fact that the interest rates are incredibly low. You can actually get a fixed 30-year mortgage at 4%, and that is tax deducted. So, actually from an Australian point of view, you can't go to right? But notwithstanding that, I think there have been a few attempts at doing something about the housing market, but all the interventions seem to have largely failed. My fifth point is about government debt. Again, this was something that was largely absent from certainly the federal government scene. We're now approaching a situation where the federal government debt is close to 100% of the GDP, so we're kind of looking at European kind of figures there. And if you think of what the federal government does now, about 65% of it is what you call locked in. So it either is in the form of entitlements or in the form of defence. So, the ability for the government to do much, particularly in the gridlock political situation, is in fact very restricted, and I'm sure, Andrew, you might get onto that. But the bottom line of that is that unless the government can do something on those entitlements, and entitlements are particularly in the health and social security area, or do something about defence expenditure, because they're all the big ticket items, they're not going to be actually able to do much about that debt. The sixth point I would make, and I guess this is more a systemic thing than a cyclical thing, is that I think there are serious question marks about the school education system in the US. They probably have the best schools, but then they have the worst schools. And the idea that they have these sort of sink schools that are, in a sense, sort of an early generator of disadvantage, I think is a real concern. And I guess the final point you would make, that as the US economy had developed, it had too much reliance on the financial services sector, just as the UK economy did too. And that, I think, is one of the reasons the adjustment to better times is creating so much trouble. Let me just take a few minutes, though, to try and end on a positive note. If you take the sort of historical record of the US economy, it is a highly dynamic and resilient economy. They have had quite significant downturns from time to time, but they have tended to bounce back. They're not bouncing back at this point in time, but they are a very open economy, and of course they have their own exchange rate, and you've seen a very significant effective depreciation in the American dollar. So if you think about Europe with their euro and the loss of that flexibility, at least in the case of the American economy, they've got their own exchange rate and they've got their own ability to undertake independent monetary policy. So that's a plus. And indeed, if you look at what's happened to exports, they've increased a lot. Sadly, the imports have increased more. But that, I think, is one sign to feel positive. The second point, I think, is that even though there's a very big federal government debt, and of course quite a lot of the states have very significant debts as well, you can't see there being any sovereign risk. There's no premium attached to interest rates for the raising of that debt. So where you see that in Greece, of course, Ireland, Portugal, and now increasingly in Italy and Spain, where the government is having to pay a significant premium to raise money through bond release, you don't see that in America. So the US dollar still remains what we call the numeraire currency, and certainly in the short term, that's a plus. The third positive point, and I say this as I understand on the day that Steve Jobs has now died, some of the best companies are definitely American companies. They are innovative, they're experimental, they're world leaders, and you see that, I think, across quite a spectrum of areas. So, you know, it's easy to feel very negative, but at the same time, you know, we've got, I think at one point in time, because of the machinations in the stock market, Apple was actually the company with the largest market cap on Wall Street. So I think sort of the innovativeness and the demonstrated resilience might give you a few grounds of hope. The final point I think I would make, and I'd wrap this into two areas, is that the demography of the US is not too bad. It's not an ageing society like a lot of those other European and Japanese economies are. In fact, even in China, the demography is not great. So, and I think a subset of the demography being, I think, reasonably helpful is that it remains a country which is open to immigration, of course, illegal and legal. I guess that's another debate. But, you know, if you go, as I have, to, you know, Silicon Valley and Sao Paulo and Alpha Palo, you're just amazed by the importance of immigrants, both in the education sector and then in the innovative IT sector. So I'll finish up there, but I don't want to sound too pessimistic, and I'm happy to be convinced by the crowd otherwise, but I think the immediate term is still pretty negative, and that, I guess, leads on to Andrew talking about the difficult political situation that the President finds himself.
I think I'm not a university lecturer, so... well, thanks, Judith. That was a great overview of the US economy and what ails it. And really it leads very naturally into what I want to talk about, which is the fact that the Obama presidency, in my view, is in very deep trouble. And I just came back from a 2-week trip to America. When I left Australia, obviously I was following the news, and I had the sense that Obama was vulnerable to a good candidate. I came back from the trip thinking Obama really could lose this election and be a one-term president. And perhaps it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but if anything, the mantra of the Obama administration, or the Obama campaign as it was then in 2008, was yes, we can, as we all remember. I think the mantra of the Obama administration today, towards the end of 2011, is this is harder than it looks. Judith overviewed the economy. I won't say much about it, but the key point, of course, politically, is that the Obama administration's economic policies are failing. We can all debate how bad the situation was, whether he's made it worse, but the key issue really is that despite all the fiscal stimulus and everything else that's been done, unemployment in the United States remains stubbornly above 9%, and there's no real sign that that's going to shift before the election in 2012. On the foreign policy front too, I'd argue that the president's had a lot of problems. His administrations look like it's reacting to events in the Middle East with the Arab Spring rather than shaping them and helping to drive them. I'm sure Dan will talk a little about that. The Middle East, where he's staked out a very ambitious position only to retreat from it, having, I would argue, alienated both sides, but particularly Israel, which is a problem for a US president running for re-election. And then on the trade policy front, relating back to the economy, where Obama's failed to get any of the FTAs that his administration supports through this gridlocked Congress. Most importantly for Australia, I think the Korea-US FTA, which really Obama needs to have in his pocket when he heads west to Honolulu for the APEC meeting next month, and I'm sure a lot of effort's going into making sure that happens. All of this translates into what I think are some pretty alarming poll results for Obama. So just to run through some of those, 11% of Americans are satisfied with how things are going in their country now. Only 20% of Americans think their country is heading in the right direction. Obama's job approval sits around 40% in most of the major polls. And American consumer confidence is very low at 55.7 out of a scale of 100. And what we've really seen is a hardening of the opposition to Obama, especially, I think, over the last year. So 4 out of 10 Americans strongly disapprove of the job he's doing. That's an unusually high number. Most people cluster around the centre and will say, oh, the president's going okay or he's not going really well. But to me, that number is a real problem for Obama's political team. Another huge problem for Obama is that he's losing support simultaneously in the centre, which he's been working very hard to court over the last year or so in particular, but also a lot of the enthusiasm has gone right out of his base, which is the progressive wing of the Democrat Party, the sort of people who came out in very large numbers and supported him in 2008 when he was elected. So just to bear out those judgments, 43% of independent voters in America disapprove with the job that Obama's doing. 47% of older Americans, Americans 65 and above, disapprove of the job he's doing. That's a real problem because, of course, America has voluntary voting in its elections, and that group of Americans traditionally is a reliable voting bloc. They tend to turn out to vote. So again, there's another problem for Obama. Job approvals, and this is really, I think, stark, going back to the comment about the sort of enthusiasm of what you might call the hopey-changey period of Obama. Americans aged 18 to 29, in that category, his approval has dropped from 67% to 45%, which, again, is a real warning bell for this administration because what that number tells me is that a lot of those kids will not turn out to vote for him again because they're disappointed in him. Americans think that he's not achieving the goals he set for his administration. The number who think he is in just the last year has fallen from over half to just over a quarter. Leadership qualities, the number who think that Obama has leadership qualities has dropped from 70% to 42%. So his polling across the board in these two critical areas for this next election are really problematic. What's interesting, if you look at the historical record, is that when you add all of that up, Obama now, compared with other first-term presidents running for re-election, is in a worse position than George W. Bush was in 2004, than Bill Clinton when he ran for re-election, than Bush Senior when he ran for re-election in 1991, losing, than Ronald Reagan and than Jimmy Carter. And his job approval numbers are lower at this stage in the political cycle than all of those leaders other than Carter. Consumer confidence in America is lower than it was for any of those presidents making their re-election bid. And of all of those presidents, the situation for Obama most resembles the situation for George Herbert Walker Bush in 1991, where he lost an election which most people thought he should have won. All of these things, I'm sure, are alarming political staffers in the White House. So can the GOP, the Republican Party, find a candidate who can beat this weakened presidency? Well, it's been a clarifying week in the Republican race just in the last couple of days. It's a perfectly timed event because we've had news that Chris Christie is not going to run for president, and we've also had news overnight that Sarah Palin won't be contesting the presidency. And I imagine the most happy person in the world about that news is Mitt Romney, because that means the race is, for all intents and purposes, now down to Romney and Rick Perry, the Republican governor of Texas. And of course, Governor Perry's had some problems in the last couple of weeks. He underperformed in the most recent debate on the Republican side. And then I'm sure many of you have read he's had this rather unfortunate naming issue with a country property. I'll leave it there. But as a result of that, Perry, I think, has dropped right back. Some of the initial excitement in the Republican base about the Perry candidacy started to sort of wane somewhat. And Mitt Romney, in some ways, could emerge from all of this as the kind of Stephen Bradbury. That's perhaps a little unkind, because in some ways he's the front runner, and I guess Bradbury wasn't. But the point here is that Mitt Romney doesn't really excite the Republican base. He's seen as too centrist, of course. He's got some baggage. The two things that most people refer to are, firstly, he's a Mormon, and no one really knows what that means, but there's an assumption that it's a problem for some of the more evangelical Christian base of the Republican Party. And the second liability is that as Governor of Massachusetts, he introduced some healthcare reforms which were, in fact, quite similar to Obama's much hated, that is, on the Republican side of politics, healthcare bill. So Romney has those liabilities. But despite that, I think Romney is not a bad candidate for this time, and that's what politics is all about. It's whether it's your time. And there are some things about Romney that make me think the White House will be very, very concerned about him as a candidate. He's a successful governor. He's run very successful businesses and created jobs. He's not given to high-blown rhetoric, and his style and his profile is about competence, diligence, careful management, prudent economic skills and judgment. And I think in this climate that we're talking about right now, those are the things the electorate's probably looking for in America. I think they're not so, they've done the kind of, big rhetorical, as I said, hopey-changey thing, and they're looking for someone to make a real difference in their lives in terms of fixing the housing problem that Judith talked about, getting Americans back to work. And I think Romney will be quite attractive in those ways. One recent poll, just bearing some of that out, has Romney at 46% and Obama at 42%, and that tells you that Romney's right in the zone. How is Obama responding to this? Well, there's been a real shift in his political tactics in the recent month or two. We've seen a much more combative Obama. There's a sense now that he's not really running on his record for reasons I've outlined, but rather is going to run against the Republican candidate, and he's going to come out hard at Romney and try and cast him as a sort of extremist figure. I think that's going to be very difficult for Obama to achieve because Romney is many things, but he's not an extremist. So the election next year, I think, at this stage anyway, is going to look much more like the 2004 election, where you had George Bush running hard against Kerry, trying to stereotype Kerry in the voters' minds as a sort of unreliable, flip-flopping kind of figure. That's kind of interesting. If Obama wins using that strategy, that's, as the Americans would say, winning ugly. And of course, it takes Obama a very long way from the sort of appealing, bipartisan, transcending figure that he was in 2008, and whether the electorate's really up for that kind of journey from its candidate will be very interesting to see. Another interesting point, of course, just to hand over to Dan, really, is that the Australian and the American political cycle have tended to work in broad synchronicity for the last few governments. So, for example, we had Hawke and Clinton, then we sort of had Howard and Bush, famously or infamously perhaps, then Rudd and Obama, with quite a few commentators identifying similarities between those two leaders. And of course, there are some parallels in the polling now in both countries. So I guess what that means is that when President Obama sits down for a cup of tea at the lodge or wherever it is, he and Prime Minister Gillard will have a lot to talk about. I'll hand over to Dan.
Assuming, of course, that it is Prime Minister Gillard in 3 or 4 weeks' time. Look, there's a lot to draw out from there. I note too that the first person to use the Hopi changey quote, though, Andrew, was Sarah Palin, and it wasn't enough for Sarah Palin, who was the arch sort of generator of that Tea Party movement, or capturing that Tea Party movement. It wasn't enough for her to catapult her into the candidacy. And I wonder to what extent that sort of anti-Obama feeling is enough for any candidate to capture. And Romney may be your person, you might be right, because he appeals to a broader set. I tend to think, and this is a very superficial judgment, but I just tend to associate Romney with Carey as that sort of candidate that's quite easily, I think in the end, quite easily cast aside. I can't see anybody at this stage from the Republican side who's... I agree with what you're saying, that Obama is very fragile. I just can't see that he's going to be seriously challenged. But that said, it should fall to me to welcome you all here to the Age, and we're very pleased to have Lowy in Melbourne, Australia's... I was going to tease you and say Australia's foreign policy city, but one of the things that I thought might be useful is just to tell a little story. A few years ago I had a scholarship which actually put me in America, and on that scholarship I was invited down to a place called Texas A&M University in Kingsville, which is right down south, past Corpus Christi in Texas. And I'd never heard of it. I'm guessing that most of you haven't either. It's not far from the border with Mexico, and they do great margaritas. A place called Matamoros. And I get down there, and it's in 2004, so it's going back a few years, and it was right in the middle of the free trade negotiations and finalisation for Australia's free trade agreement with the United States. And I was asked to give a speech, and I wanted to take this seriously, and I had to work hard to have a great deal of specialty in economics, so I had to work quite hard on this speech to talk about this FTA and what this meant for the relationships between the two countries. And I spent quite a lot of time on it and went down there and delivered my speech to the students at Texville A&M University. And first hand goes up in the audience, and the very first question to me was, how long was the flight? So, and I mean, that's fine, that's a university audience. They're going to ask you, you've got somebody somewhat exotic coming all the way across from Australia. But this flight across the Pacific, this lengthy, some of us will have done it, 15 or 16-hour flight, depending on which way you go, is a long flight. It's twice been too long for Obama to come all the way to Australia. And presuming that he turns up this time, and I think that we haven't heard any rumbles that he won't, but presuming that he turns up this time, what does it going to speak to in terms of the relationship between our two countries? Well, I just want to start with the presentation that we're giving today and the title, which has been labelled as the Pacific President. And I think it would be smart to put a question mark on the Pacific President, because I don't yet see the evidence that, despite a lot of the claims, that Obama has yet become the Pacific President. Now, just take the twice cancelled trips to Australia. Now, of course, understandable reasons that he gave for doing that. And responding with great charm, when Prime Minister Gillard visited Washington earlier this year, the Americans really pulled out all the stops and had her in kicking footballs in the White House with the President, and took a trip out to a Washington school, which we know is one of Miss Gillard's passions, because foreign policy is not. But they really did pull out all the stops. But one of the things that they did do is they also put on this joint sitting of Congress speech for her, which was a somewhat invidious position for a still very new Prime Minister who hadn't really, if you like, earned her place. Certainly it was a recognition that Australia is so important in the alliance relationship that the Americans would bestow this honour upon a visiting Australian leader. But for Miss Gillard herself, it put her in an awkward political position, because these sorts of speeches, of course, play very heavily back home and less so in the United States. But they also knew, her advisers also knew, that the Congress, having recently passed hands to the Republicans, was going to be full of a number of fairly young Republican congresspeople who would likely walk out if she gave a really boring sort of standard, we're very close alliance partners type of a speech. So they responded by giving a somewhat mawkish speech where she talked about her childhood, and it didn't...
The Man on the Moon.
The Man on the Moon, that's right. And it didn't ring true in terms of what we thought we knew about Julia Gillard back in an Australian audience. But I think that the under-examined consequence of this is the way in which that action also impacted on the esteem of the United States alliance in terms of the way in which the US is viewed within Australia. And one of the things that I wanted to pluck out today is that this is particularly evident amongst younger Australians. And the Lowy polls actually are quite helpful on this. If you look at the breakdown of the polling that talks about the importance that's accorded to the alliance relationship, very few people in that polling are willing to junk it. Nobody, a very small number, regard the United States alliance for Australia as not at all important. But age, the age of the respondent, is a very good predictor for how important they are likely to regard the alliance. For those that are over 60, the alliance is far more likely to be seen as the most important, or even somewhat important, than for those that are in a much younger age bracket, say 18 to 25. And those figures, which I plucked out from this year's Lowy Institute poll, seem to me, on a fairly cursory reading I must confess, but seem to me to be still quite similar to figures that were also evident in a 2008 AsiaLink poll that looked at the Australia-United States alliance relationship, and where young people were far more likely to see a close relationship with the United States as a hindrance for Australia in terms of its relationship with Asia. And I think that this is an area in which we haven't yet examined the consequences enough in terms of what this will mean for our US alliance partnership, particularly in the context of China's rise, because it is, after all, the youth of today that will be running the show tomorrow. So, to some extent, I think that there is still evidence of an anxious wait amongst sections of Australia, and particularly amongst some policymakers, who are waiting for the China bubble to burst. And if the China bubble bursts, then we can get back to normal with the United States, and it will become a lot simpler. But what I think is also gradually emerging is that the way in which we talk about these key relationships, both with the United States and with China, is becoming somewhat captured by the more, if I can say it, more noxious ideological type of politics which is evident in this country and evident too, I think, somewhat in what Andrew was saying in the United States. We can see this in terms of the debates about China and whether China can be Australia's partner because of its authoritarian system, lack of democracy, and we can also see it in terms of some of the economic debates just on the front page of The Age earlier this week, with unions calling for tougher action on China, which in essence is just a form of protectionism. So I don't have answers for this. I just think that this is the moment that we're starting to find ourselves caught in. And what interests me is the way in which some of this polling data is playing out amongst the youth. I think too, in terms of the interpretation of the United States returning to the Pacific as if it was being somewhat absent throughout the Bush years, which is a somewhat simplistic analysis, I think. And Andrew will likely talk on China issues on that score. But I do think that it's still very much for this president in the United States that it's been the Middle East that's most defined his presidency in terms of foreign policy issues. That and an economic story. It hasn't been a Pacific story, but I think that there are some that have been very willing to try and convince themselves that it has been a Pacific presidency. And to look at it through a local lens, in Australia, there's been quite a bit of talk about the drive for US bases or for enhanced US presence within Australia, as if that's something that's just come up in the last couple of years. Well, to my reading, this is very much something that is being driven by the Australian side. And we saw this here in Melbourne last year when there was quite a bit of press reporting just before the visit by Hillary Clinton and Robert Gates, the then US Defence Secretary, about this issue of US bases in Australia. And I sat at a round table with a number of journalists with Secretary Gates, and we asked him this question, and it was very evident from his response that this was all news to him. So I think that this drive was coming very much from the Australian side, which has been, of course, welcomed by the United States, and they're looking at it quite seriously. But I think we are still a long way away from settling what will be the result. So if I can go back to my initial story about Australia being a long way away, one thing that I think we should be wary of, despite we may get occasionally soothed by a few of the usual voices in terms of our relationship with the United States, sometimes, yes, we are a long way away. Sometimes we have to accept that we're a long way away. And if we make a big deal about it, we can inadvertently provoke some annoyance from the US side. I just thought I'd chuck a few little grenades on that one. And that's it from me.
Thanks, Dan. Well, for me, that was really great sitting here and trying to, on the balance as a whole, trying to see if we're on the negative or the positive side, I guess, overall, thinking about the US. I think Judith started with 6 sort of negative points, but ended very positively about America and where it's heading and the history of American companies and youth being on our side. And we had from Andrew a very clear position that the Obama presidency is in serious trouble. His economic policies, foreign policy, trade policy, and a bit of analysis of how things are looking with his actual contenders. And then from Dan, we really got into, I guess, where this puts Australia and where Australia should be heading in the future. So I guess going back to the panel is sort of my overall question and feeling is just sort of, do you want to bet your house on Australia or on America or in Asia? Where is it that you would like to, really fall on that if you had to fall one side of the line?
Well, let me just pick up on the economy. It may be that there is a parallel, I think, between the Australian situation and the American situation in that I think a minority government in this country is impeding the effective development and implementation of economic policy, and basically the gridlock in America is doing the same. And it may be that if you get a very clear change, I think if Obama were defeated, the Republicans in charge
certainly one of the houses, maybe in both, you would get, I think, perhaps policies that are more implementable. But, the word of caution I would give to you is that I think these problems are quite intractable, and the idea that the Republicans have the solutions, I think that's not true. I think it's, even an opinionated, forceful type like me, it's not quite clear what to do, not a good place to start, and I think it will take a lot of time to unpick some of these problems. I would just finish, though, by making the point that I think some of these campaign slogans can come back and bite you on the bum, because it seems to me when Obama said, yes, we can, it actually now invites the response was, no, we couldn't.
I think that's absolutely right. One thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about is how this kind of political, I hesitate to call it a malaise, but it looks a bit like a malaise, is something that we're seeing right across the Western world today. So, we've talked about Australia and the United States, but have a look at Japan, which even before the earthquake was in a much worse position than the US in terms of its debt situation and its demography and everything else, and now has got a $200 billion recovery bill to throw into the equation. The UK, which has a minority government, arguably travelling a bit better than some of the others, but still a minority government. And then, of course, Europe, and I suspect Judith knows this better than me, but I suspect there's a whole lot more to play out in terms of the sort of unwinding of the European economic situation. So if you look right across the world from a kind of Western perspective, it is possible to be very negative and to think, well, the rot... is this the rot? Is this the end of empire? That whole sort of declinist narrative. But then, if you study other systems, and the one that everyone's talking about is China, I still come down saying that I'd rather be, us. And I say that because of the massive internal problems they face. Let's leave the sort of foreign policy side out of it, but the Chinese economy is still very dependent on exports to Western developed economies, which are all tanking. In the last couple of years, since the global financial crisis, China's response, instead of moving in the direction of economic reforms that China needs to make, like opening up its own internal economy and moving more to a consumption-based model, has moved in exactly the wrong direction. So all of the fiscal stimulus money pumped in by the Chinese Communist Party was pumped into state-owned enterprises, making, guess what, cheap manufactured exports to sell to Europe and the United States. So that model, in my view, is if the Western economic model is broken, then the Chinese one's broken too. And they've got no social welfare system, they've got a terrible demographic outlook, they've got massive problems with social unrest, environmental challenges, corruption. So a lot of ivory tower academics in Australia sort of are quite attracted to this Confucian, directed capitalism model. I suspect it doesn't look anywhere near as good from the inside.
Yeah, I'm put in mind of, I think what Judith said put me in mind of that old Irish joke about, the bloke who was driving along the road and stopped next to an Irish farmer and said, I need directions to get out of this mess, to get out of here. Farmer responds and says, I wouldn't start from here. and it does have that sort of feel. It's just like things are in a bit of a mess. I think I kind of broadly agree, but a couple of things. The UK has it a bit different because they're not a minority government, they're a coalition government. That's an important distinction from what's happening in Australia, and I think that does free up politics a little bit. But that said, wider Europe is caught in a malaise, and I don't think that there are that many people that would advocate a Chinese system for Australia. I'm certainly not of that view, but I think that there is real question marks asked about China's sort of strategic rise and what this will mean for the dominance of Western democracy. And I think that those are very worthwhile questions that we do have to think about because of who we are and because of the comfort zone that we've found ourselves in for the last few hundred years under the effective hegemony of Western empire, if I can put it that way.
Great, thank you. Now open it up to the floor with particular comments. I'll just share the microphone.
Thanks very much. We're all fascinated by the Republican dogfight, Andrew. There was an interesting piece. My name's Ian Wilcott, by the way. There's an interesting piece by David Brooks in the New York Times yesterday. As people know, a relatively conservative commentator in the New York Times. And you see poor David Brooks desperately trying to fall in love with Mitt Romney. And that I think, is the huge challenge now for the Republican base, isn't it? I mean, on both sides, it's the activists who choose the candidate. You can see how Romney would have broad appeal in the general election. But how does he get out of the primary process?
It's a great question, and a lot of you will know the American system. It's not like ours. American politics is, at this stage of the nomination process at least, a contest for the extremes. And then only then in a general election does it tend to sort of converge back as a contest in the centre. And this is Romney's huge challenge. Romney, I think, is far and away the best. I don't think he's a fantastic candidate, but I think he's far and away the best Republican candidate to win the centre in a general election. Ian's question is, how does he get there? I think some of the answers are old-fashioned. Money. He's got a lot of it. He's been really effective at fundraising. He's built up a huge war chest, much bigger than any of the other. Well, there's only effectively one other candidate, I would say, left. He's got a big war chest. He's got going for him the fact that even though Perry has a certain appeal in the base, the reality that large parts of even the conservative Republican Party, especially the Bush kind of Republicans, who are also from Texas, don't like him and are already trying to undermine him. Karl Rove came out against his candidacy right at the start. So I think it's not going to be clear-cut in the sense that there's no one candidate appealing direct to the base and then Romney sort of with what's left over. I think Perry's appeal to the base is problematic, and I think ultimately enough people in the base will respond if Romney positions himself well to say, we don't like everything about this guy, not all of us will turn out to vote, but enough of us recognise that he can beat Obama. And the key point here is this is an election about Obama. It's going to be a referendum on Obama. And that will unite Republicans, I think, beyond the sort of traditional, social war sort of agenda.
Of course, being from Texas is no bad thing when you think of the locations of previous presidents. Okay, I'm prepared to be a dumb blonde here because I don't understand things religious. But what I did not appreciate is that Christians do not regard Mormons as Christian. This was news to me. I thought we're all one big, large, happy family, broad church. No, they are not in the Christian church. And so there is a lot of hostility from the I guess, more fundamental Christian movement to Mormonism. So that, I think, is important.
Yep.
So, and, this was very Christian of me, I think, to admit that I had no idea about this, but, yeah.
There's no doubt that's a factor.
Yeah.
Les Pickett, I have a comment and then a question. One of your colleagues, Andrew, wrote an excellent book, which I've just finished, which really should be almost compulsory reading. It puts the current US-Australia situation into a historic context and puts some very challenging bits. I forget the name, but it's damn good.
That's Michael Wesley's There Goes the Neighbourhood.
That's it.
And it won a big prize too.
Yeah, it's quite cheap and one might read. But it's
Great product placement, thank you.
It's very, very good. Recommend reading that. My question is this. What's the likelihood of a late start candidate for the presidency from the Republican Party?
Well, the one that everyone was talking about was Chris Christie, and he's just ruled himself out. And the possibility of him running was causing quite a bit of excitement in the race, a race that frankly hadn't excited a whole lot of Republicans, which is going back to Ian's point. Who's left? I don't know that there's another candidate out there to come in. I mean, Christie would have been the logical sort of late starter, create a whole lot of excitement, unstoppable momentum, burn off the others, and suddenly he's there. I just can't see anyone else doing that. The Republicans, ironically, will have a great field in 2016, a much better field than they do now, not least because Jeb Bush will come into contention there. The sort of prevailing wisdom is that it's too early to be a Bush in 2012, but it might be okay in 2016. Who knows? And there's a couple of other governors around. There's Paul Ryan, who's a very smart younger member of Congress who's put together quite a sophisticated and attractive economic package. So there are people around for a bit down the track, and the problem for the Republicans, frankly, is I don't think they expected 2 years ago to be in this contest. So a lot of people will have stayed out and not done their fundraising and not, done all the things you need to do to prepare for a run now. So, I mean, there may be someone, I'll probably be made to look like an idiot tomorrow when someone declares, but I can't see it.
Do you see any possibility of an alternate Democratic candidate running for the presidency?
No, in short. I think there's a real possibility, by the way, something to watch, that Hillary will run as Vice President on Obama's ticket with a view to positioning herself for 2016.
Okay. On a slightly different perspective, you have barely touched on defence at all, and the Australia-US relationship has, in fact, in the past been mainly based on defence questions. Do you see them being relevant in this particular visit?
I think they will, and I probably differ a little from Dan. I think we will hear announcements during this visit about defence and about closer.
I've no doubt we'll hear announcements as whether that mean anything.
Well, that's always a question. I think it's hugely important and becoming more important, not less important. And I've written an essay, which I might as well plug, seeing Michael Wesley's book's got a plug, called Uncharted Waters, where I basically make the case that this sort of choice argument that Dan alludes to, that, if we trade big time with China, at some point that's going to cause a kind of rupture or a need for us to distance ourselves from the US. I completely disagree with that. My argument is that China is sufficiently different from us and problematic for us as an economic partner that we need the extra strategic reassurance and confidence that comes from a strong US alliance to deal with China. So if we're going to become more dependent on China economically, my argument is it makes sense to become tighter with the US, not further away, because that's the best way we can maintain our strategic autonomy, our freedom of action and decision-making, and ultimately our sovereignty.
Can I just pick up on, though, an interesting interaction with the economic situation and the budgetary situation? We are entering a phase where economics will be the tail that's wagging the defence dog.
Right.
If you look at the defence vote and you look in combination with health and social security, they have to do something about those three big ticket items. So the idea that, foreign policy initiatives, well...
Social security... The social security issue is being badly misrepresented. Social security at this point in time is about $4.7 trillion in the black. So, saying that they have to do something about social security in this context.
Well, it's all the extra. But the point is that there are now clearly sort of budgetary constraints in relation to what can be done in the defence field. And that's a kind of new way of thinking.
Well, we know that there will be $500 million of cuts to the US defence budget, and if this super committee doesn't reach an agreement, and who would back that right now, then the amount of defence cuts will go up to about $1 trillion. of defence cuts over the next decade. And for a country like Australia that's facing, I would argue, a much more uncertain strategic environment, that is, I think, really quite worrying.
But that's where they're looking at us. I mean, this is where the basis thing actually comes into the equation, because I mean, just go through the numbers. I mean, the Americans have got 11 aircraft carrier fleets, which are extraordinarily expensive things to maintain. And who are they arrayed against? You know, they're about projection of US power. So, you know, when they might look at bases, and I still don't think this is settled, but they might look at bases as in essence, a sort of a way of burden sharing again. I mean, we're back to those sorts of arguments a bit. So they're some of the ways in which it comes in. But I'd agree. I mean, I think economics drives this.
I know we're running out of time, so Nick and the gentleman at the back, and we'll take a last question.
I had a quick comment and then a question. The comment was, I mean, we're talking about Rick Perry. He's actually from A&M, Texas A&M. And
there's a lot of A&M.
Remember that Bush was a Yale man. His father was CIA director. I mean, the Bushes are not Texans.
No.
So,
No.
I mean, that's important in Republican sense.
That's a strong point.
That there's quite a distinction between the Bushes and the sort of base that Perry's got within the Republican Party. And that's sort of my question about to what extent is not just Obama, but a delegitimisation of Washington and the banks and so on. No one mentioned how the GFC has affected perceptions of politics, both from the right and the left, because it seems to me that if you're going to start talking about cutting debt, cutting health, addressing social security and so on, that involves significant challenges whichever politician is in power, and there seems to be no basis for either party to launch a significant cutback of entitlements, given that they'll get hammered politically. And I wonder if you could comment on that, because no one did. And it seems to me if we're going to talk about cutting tax debt, there needs to be some questions about that in the long term.
The polling shows that the most in play and potentially the most decisive block of votes in this coming election will be the people that American pundits are calling the disaffected. And going back to what Judith was talking about, these tend to be men, they tend to be older men, and they tend to be from the Midwest and places like that. And what's really interesting is when you interrogate their views, they're not actually big sort of deficit hawk, you know, government should get out of the way. People, they're just really disaffected because, you know, they've lost their houses, they've lost their jobs, family break up, the whole lot of it. So, I mean, I think you're right, Nick. I don't know who they they detest Barack Obama, that's pretty clear from the polling. But are they really going to coalesce around a Mitt Romney? I mean, who knows? And I think this speaks to a growing problem of sort of disenchantment, that, you know, the underside of what I was talking about before across the Western world. We've had the riots in London, we've got this Tea Party phenomenon in the United States. I guess where I differ a bit is that I find it sort of a little bit, just to be provocative, I find it a little bit ironic that when the centre-left is in government in Australia, suddenly all political debate's corrosive. Whereas having worked for the previous government, I can tell you it felt fairly corrosive before 2007. And I think there's something similar in the United States. Again, I was living there for 4 years during the Bush period, and politics in America were not noted for their civility then. So I think we just need to be a little bit careful about some of the sort of characterisation of US politics, and Australia's for that matter.
My question is, I wanted to, Joe Griffin, from Victoria University, wanted to just invert the discussion marginally. Dan made a comment about if Gillard was still going to be Prime Minister at the time of the visit. And there's lots of pressures in terms of the popularity of sort of Obama, the popularity of Gillard at this point in time. What do you see as the implications of the visit for Australian politics, and particularly for the Prime Ministership of Gillard, given the timing of the actual visit, and then that would lead to Christmas? It buys Gillard potentially a lot of time to refocus or regain some level of notoriety or popularity.
Oh, look, I said it flippantly. I don't think that, who knows whether she'll be around or not, but what I also said flippantly, but I do actually think it's quite significant, is the point that she made off the cuff, seemingly, during a live cross from Brussels last year on the 7:30 report, where she said that foreign policy was not her passion, was actually a very big mistake, because it gave away a whole area of being prime ministerial, just in terms of the optics, so that when people like me write about Julia Gillard saying something about foreign policy, as I did last week, after she gave what I thought was a fairly impressive speech on the Asian century, you still feel the need to make a note in there that Julia Gillard has said previously that foreign policy is not her passion. So where this visit perhaps gives her an opportunity, and it's not just this visit, I should note too, she's about to embark on what's probably the most intense part of foreign policy part of the prime ministerial year. In some ways is becoming the most intense foreign policy focus for any Australian Prime Minister, because of the proliferation, the number of heads of government meetings that have now crowding onto the agenda. So at the end of this year we've got APEC, we've got Commonwealth heads of government meetings, we've got East Asia Summit, and then we've got the Obama visit, which has got the Queen here and all that as well. So this is a moment for Gillard to, as I think you're alluding to possibly stand up and to present herself. She doesn't have to do it in a self-conscious way. She can, just merely by being herself and carrying it through. She may well win some kudos for this. I'm going to be hung out on this, I'm sure, but I'm of the view that this Parliament will survive, that the minority government will actually go through to very close to full term, because I think that the people that have the most at stake in this are the independents. They're at the brass ring at the moment. They're not going to walk away from that. So I think that she will grow in the job. Whether it's enough to save her, well, I'm not sure that there's any point to this
It was a
speculation.
very foolish thing to say, though, because actually, if you look at all our prime ministers, none of them probably had a passion for foreign policy when they took over, and most of them took some time to grow into it. John Howard, I recall.
Kevin Rudd,
but it was
Kevin Rudd might be, but he was nauseous.
And that was what she was trying to do, was to distinguish herself against Rudd.
Yeah.
I mean,
I see. But, the truth of the matter is that most of our prime ministers have had to grow into the role as, foreign policy expert and implementer of that policy, and most of them have done it very well, and I think actually grown to enjoy it. So why she opted to say that, maybe in a sense it's sort of lovingly honest, but somehow I don't think the public really reward you for being lovingly honest.
Well, in this instance, I don't think it's the public though. It's frankly it's an
inside the
Beltway and inside Beltway stuff. But it hurts because every time it talks down her credibility.
Just a little footnote though: these events always look attractive to PM's press office and all that sort of thing. But I think you can exaggerate how much of a bounce they deliver. I mean, I remember Howard APEC 2007. I was there, and certainly didn't deliver much of a bounce. And Rudd famously was just about to head off to the G20. I think 2 days after he was axed. So I mean, these things. There's no doubt she has a great opportunity to look prime ministerial for a couple of days, and they'll be the pictures people see. But I think you can exaggerate the impact, perhaps.
Can I say that I also disagree with Dan, because I think the pokies will trip up the Prime Minister. We don't understand it in Victoria. We really don't. It's a New South Wales and a Queensland phenomenon. The size of those clubs, the power of those clubs, they are in working class suburbs, and it's a very palpable impact at the moment.
I'm really conscious of the time, and we've gone completely over the time. Thanks very much for coming, and hopefully see you at our next event. Thank you.